Welcome to the third episode of my new podcast, No Questions Asked. I called it that because my cat is my co-pilot and he doesn't ask any questions. That's because he already knows everything that a cat needs to know. But his participation in this podcast is critical. You see, a podcast with a cat is bound to be much more popular than one without a cat. My cat is an influencer and a thought leader. In any case, enough about my cat. I may mention him now and again just to keep your attention riveted. Part 1. Western Diplomacy is Dead. This episode is called The Fog of Diplomacy. The fog of diplomacy is not a commonly used term, but perhaps it should be. Diplomacy used to be the work of professional diplomats. They worked hard to resolve important differences between warring sides. They drafted peace treaties that were then enacted and ratified by national governments. These official documents formed the body of international law. Now, instead of professionally drafted documents, we have lists of talking points. They are concocted by people who aren't even trained diplomats. These people have nothing to do with the warring sides. Even if somebody signs them, they are not legally enforceable. The peace deal between Israel and Hamas was not signed by Israel or Hamas. No matter who else signed it, it is invalid. Israel went right back to bombing Gaza. Hamas went right back to rearming and getting ready to continue the fight. Did this violate the peace deal? No, it didn't. Why? Because there is no peace deal. But you probably think that there was. That's what the TV said, wasn't it? That, my friends, is what I mean by the fog of diplomacy. Part 2. The Fog of War. Most likely you've heard the expression the fog of war more than once or twice. This term has been used often enough to be considered a cliché. Clichés have a strange life of their own. They persist even if the phenomenon they characterize no longer exists, or never existed to begin with. Have you heard the cliché Potemkin village? Well, Prince Potemkin never built any Potemkin villages. He built cities like Sevastopol, a city of 500,000. He also built Yekaterinoslav, now Dnepropetrovsk, a city of close to 1,000,000. The term Potemkin village is ancient fake news endlessly recycled as a cliché. The term the fog of war is a cliché that has lost its relevance and needs to be retired. It relates to the fact that wars used to be impossible to keep track of as they happened. Now they are some of the best understood major processes we have. Anyone with an IQ above room temperature knew that the Ukraine would lose and Russia would win. It was and is a mathematical certainty all along. The interim results of the conflict remained predictable throughout. I will provide some details on this point a bit later on, but it wasn't always this way. It used to be that once hostilities commenced, it became very difficult to tell what was happening. Accurate information was hard to gather. There was official secrecy that was actually rigorously enforced. Secret orders were issued. Troop movements took place in secret. There weren't any media leaks, and media reports were carefully censored. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, uncertainty and confusion reigned. The results of battles were often inconclusive. The number of casualties was kept secret. Because of all that, accurate information was difficult to find, especially if it was about the enemy, but also about your own side or friendly forces. This gave rise to the phenomenon that went under the ridiculous name of friendly fire. But a lot has changed since then. Thanks to satellites, long-range radars, and drones, the battlefield is now a panopticon. Bunkers are destroyed as soon as they're discovered. Foxholes are relatively safe because they aren't worth expending an artillery shell. Tanks, APCs, and vehicles are targeted whether they're moving or stationary. Kamikaze drones sit in wait on the side of the road. Soldiers infiltrate enemy territory in twos and threes. But some things never change. Both sides in an armed conflict still use disinformation as a tool. Reporters still collect facts that support official narratives. Failing that, they just make stuff up. Part 3. The Fog of Peace. If you think that wars are terrible, peace is sometimes even worse. Think of life in post-revolutionary Russia, or in Germany during the Weimar Republic. Wars tend to go on consuming lives and resources until they don't. And then the damage they caused persists for several generations. Dipping birth rates in Russia echo civilian population losses of World War II. The cliché, the fog of war, may no longer be applicable, but there may still be the fog of peace. Not always. The American war in Afghanistan ended for a specific reason. A flood of Chinese/Mexican fentanyl entering the United States made Afghani heroin unprofitable. It no longer made sense for NATO troops to guard poppy fields and to fly out the heroin on military transports via Camp Bondsteel in Kosovo. But things aren't always this crisp. A good historical example of the fog of peace is how World War I ended. Why did Germany decide to stop fighting? It was occupying quite a bit of France at the time. German soldiers were fighting on foreign soil. They could have kept fighting for a long time yet. One theory is that Germany gave up because of taxes. To keep fighting, it would have had to raise taxes on the rich. And the rich wanted to get richer from the war, not poorer. And why did Russia pull out of World War I just as it was winning? Russia could have walked away with a huge prize. Conventional wisdom is that Russia pulled out because of the revolution. But Russia wanted to pull out even before the revolution. Another theory is that maybe both Russia and Germany just took a pause that refreshes. They needed time to clean house, retrain, rearm, and then they went right back at it under new management. Both Germany and Russia had huge management issues at the time. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany was a bit of a nutcase. He was emotional, impulsive, and sentimental. He kept threatening people and making enemies needlessly. His cousin, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, had a different set of serious problems. Nicholas Romanov was too much of a nice guy. He wasn't even sure that monarchy was a good thing. Plus, he wasn't even particularly Russian. His wife and children spoke English among themselves. His only son and sole heir, Prince Alexander, was genetically defective. Inbred English blood inherited from Queen Victoria gave him hemophilia. His blood didn't clot, and he bled and bruised constantly. The Romanov dynasty was clearly in trouble, and so Russia sued for peace. It negotiated a separate peace with Germany. Separate peace is a technical expression you should make note of. Russia left its allies, France and Britain, to fight Germany on their own. To reach an agreement with Germany, it gave up a lot of territory. But then Germany gave up altogether and got raped in the Treaty of Versailles. And then Russia, as the USSR, gained back much of the territory it gave up. It never got back Poland or Finland. Good riddance, most Russians now think. At the time, Russia clearly needed a break. The government of Nicholas II was clearly a no-go. It was very deeply in debt to French bankers and bondholders. The Bolsheviks repudiated this debt as onerous. There was a brief experiment with bourgeois democracy. It was known as the interim government, and it was a disaster. And then the Bolsheviks, the communist revolutionaries, took control. Russia and Germany signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March of 1918. There followed a period of chaos, civil war, and even some foreign interventions. And then Stalin took the reins and did some major house cleaning. He got rid of the radical communist proponents of world revolution. Leon Trotsky was sent into internal exile, then external exile, and then killed. Instead of world revolution, Stalin set to building socialism in one separate country. His plan was a raging success, with fastest economic growth ever recorded anywhere. Russia industrialized rapidly and was then able to destroy the Third Reich. The Third Reich drew resources and received support from all over Europe. A contemporary analogy would be a war between Russia and all of NATO. Now do you see how unpredictable and tricky peace can be? Germany's capitulation in World War I gave rise to the Third Reich, and Russia's separate peace with Germany in World War I gave rise to the USSR, and the rise of the USSR led to the defeat of the Third Reich in World War II. Here's the important point from all this. A separate peace can be quite a wonderful magic trick, especially if your government is a corrupt, dysfunctional mess. And if you need time to clean house and reorganize, and especially if you owe a lot of money to your allies. Now, does that remind you of anyone? Anyone at all? Like the United States of today, perhaps? Hopelessly in debt to its allies, check. Saddled with a dysfunctional government that's begging for a revolution, check. A sick, hopelessly divided society just short of being at war with itself, check. In dire need of modernization and reindustrialization, check. Stuck in an unwinnable military conflict that drains resources, check. Isn't America of 2025 quite a lot like Russia in 2017? And wouldn't a separate peace with Russia be just what the doctor ordered for the US? Part 4. Warfare made simple. The fog of war no longer exists. What happened to it, you might ask? What about all that secrecy and confusion and treachery and propaganda? Well, it's just not effective anymore, sorry. What is the largest military conflict since the conclusion of World War II? It is Russia's special military operation in the former Ukraine. The length of the front line is variously estimated at between 800 and 1,200 kilometers. The number of combatants on both sides is easily 1.5 million men. Over 1 million lives have been lost so far on the Ukrainian side, and possibly as much as 1/10 of that on the Russian side. The exact figures will remain a state secret until the operation is finished. The operation commenced in February of 2022 as a limited military police action. It pursued 2 goals. The first goal was to thwart Ukrainian attack on Donbas. The second goal was to force the Kiev regime to negotiate. It was successful in both instances. The attack on Donbas was successfully prevented. And in July of 2022, Russian and Ukrainian negotiators initialed a draft agreement to end hostilities. According to this draft, Donetsk and Lugansk regions would join the Russian Federation. The Ukraine would allow Russia land access to Crimea. Ukrainian army would be limited to 200,000 men. Its weapons would be restricted to those posing no threat to Russia. The Ukraine agreed never to join NATO. The Ukraine agreed to military neutrality and non-bloc status. The Ukraine agreed not to allow any foreign troops on its territory. All seemed sweetness and light. And then the despicable cretin Boris Johnson arrived in Kiev. He told the Ukrainians to keep fighting to the last Ukrainian, which is what they have been doing ever since. The Russians responded by a shift of strategy. The military police action was terminated. Instead, they commenced something that Russian military strategists call izmor. It doesn't translate directly, but it means something like devastation, annihilation, or attrition. The idea is to wear down the other side to a point where it no longer poses a threat. This strategy leaves little chance. It is strictly by the numbers. The side that has more men, more artillery shells, more bombs, more drones, more of everything, is guaranteed to win. The Russians have been working at inflicting around 1,400 casualties per day, every day. Meanwhile, the casualties on the Russian side are perhaps a tenth of that number, perhaps less. Russia's population is 144 million. The Ukraine's population is claimed to be around 37 million, but we need to subtract the 7 million Ukrainian refugees and the 1.5 million war casualties, and then we get less than 30 million. The rosiest possible projection is that 20% or 6 million of this population is military-age men. At a rate of attrition of 1,400 men lost per day, the Ukraine could theoretically keep fighting for 12 years. That would be quite literally fighting down to the very last Ukrainian, except that a single very last Ukrainian wouldn't be able to hold an 800 to 1,200 kilometer front line. It takes on the order of 1 million soldiers to do that reliably. And so 6 million men becomes 5 million, and 12 years become 10 years. But that's just in theory. In reality, after just 4 years of war, the Ukrainian army is already woefully short of men. In September of 2025, Zelensky declared that the Ukraine can continue fighting for 3 more years. But if we look at the official numbers from Ukrainian sources, a different picture emerges. The Ukraine is able to mobilize 30,000 men a month, but then 21,000 of them immediately desert. Another data point from the Secretary of a Parliamentary Committee is that 80% of the mobilized men escape from training centers. The best, most accurate estimate is currently as follows. Of the 30,000 men mobilized each month, 21,000 run away. Of the remaining 9,000, 4,000 can actually fight at the front. And of these 4,000, 2,000 refuse to fight. The estimate of 5 million reservists thus effectively becomes just 300,000. And at 1,400 casualties per day, the Ukrainian army has half a year left. But that's still too optimistic. According to 2 different Ukrainian sources, the Ukrainian army will be gone in just 4 months, by April of 2025. Meanwhile, the Russian military is growing by around 350,000 professionals and volunteers per year. Just a fraction of the Russian army is deployed to the Ukrainian front at any given time. But that's still too optimistic. These estimates are based on a linear extrapolation, but armies don't collapse linearly. They collapse catastrophically. Exact time estimates are tricky, but can this leave any doubt in any intelligent person's mind as to who won and who lost? None at all. Part 5. Who is Mr. Trump? Say what you will about Donald Trump, but he isn't a fool. He can do the back-of-the-envelope math that I just did, and he can figure out just as well as I did that the Ukraine is finished. Being a businessman, Trump knows what to do in a situation like that. You cash out, cut your losses, and leave someone else holding the bag. But how do you do that if you're a businessman and not a diplomat? I'm sure that it would never even occur to Trump to ask this question. And so he just got some people together and brainstormed. None of these people were diplomats either. The result was a sort of wish list. Wishful thinking has never produced a workable peace treaty. Neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians had anything to do with it. And then this list was leaked to the press. This, mind you, is the exact opposite of successful diplomacy. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov had this to say about it: "It is professional diplomacy not to allow any leaks until the final agreement has been reached." Unfortunately, in the West, professional diplomacy is dead. There is not a single professional diplomat in Trump's cabinet. In fact, there is a question as to their professionalism in any capacity. Did Kash Patel figure out who ordered and organized the hit on Charlie Kirk? Did Pam Bondi successfully appoint a prosecutor for the cases against James Comey and Letitia James? Did Scott Bessent successfully negotiate a trade deal with China? Perhaps there are professional diplomats in Europe? Who is the top diplomat in the European Union? It's that Estonian twit, Kaja Kallas, aka Kaka. Her bit of input on the whole thing was that the EU has to weaken Russia through sanctions and to help the former Ukraine. She also thought that Russia should reduce the size of its military. Sure, and Jupiter should reduce the size of its moons. She will be the last person in the world to think that the former Ukraine can still win. But perhaps that is not a correct use of the verb to think. But this is Europe's top diplomat. No, diplomacy is dead in Europe as well. And if you can't be diplomatic, why not just be rude? It's easy. Let's propose that the Ukrainians cut their army in half. According to the Istanbul Agreement, the Ukrainians would have to limit their army to 200,000 men. And according to Putin's standard operating procedure, the initial proposal is always the best, and each next proposal is less favorable to the other side. This means that the right answer would be less than 200,000 men. But we're dumb, so let's propose 600,000 men. Moving on. Let's propose that we lift certain sanctions on Russia, but only if the Russians behave well. Putting the winning side in a war on probation, how brilliant is that? Also, please note that the sanctions on Russia are illegal. The only sanctions that are allowed under international law are the ones approved by the UN. Moving on, it is proposed that the Ukraine be kept from joining NATO for 40 years. Neutral, non-bloc, demilitarized Ukraine is Russia's requirement. But why 40 years? Is it because the Israelites once wandered in the desert for 40 years? Whose strange brain juice is this? And then it is proposed that the Ukraine be allowed to join the EU. Russia was not against that back when the EU was a trade organization, but now it is a political/military organization that is at war with Russia. Sanctions of the sort unsanctioned by the UN are an act of war, and the EU imposed 19 packets of sanctions on Russia and is hard at work on the 20th packet. This makes the proposal that the Ukraine join the EU not a peace plan, but a war plan. This is probably not what Trump wants, if he knows what he's doing. Trump wants to arbitrate the Russia-Ukraine conflict, to act as an arbitrageur in good faith. Successful arbitrage depends on trust. And what trust can there be if the arbitrageur violates international law and doesn't even realize it? It is clear that Trump and his people don't understand diplomacy. They don't know international law either. But that hasn't stopped them from trying to redraw Russia's borders. These are now Russia's borders, mind you, not the former Ukraine's borders. The borders of the Russian Federation are defined by the Russian Constitution. According to the Russian Constitution, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson regions are part of the Russian Federation. They are part of the Russian Federation in their geographic boundaries. The fact that they are partially occupied by Ukrainian troops does not change this fact. The Russian Constitution contains provisions for expanding Russian territory, but it contains no provisions for alienating any part of it. Failing to take this into account, Trump's team proposed the following: Donetsk and Lugansk become entirely Russian. Ukrainian troops withdraw. But the areas from which they withdraw become demilitarized zones. Russian territory becomes demilitarized. I think I hear peals of laughter coming from the headquarters of Russia's general staff. It gets even sillier. Zaporozhye and Kherson are to be carved up based on the current line of separation. No Russian official would ever seriously discuss, never mind agree to such a deal. But these are minor details almost irrelevant to the overall scheme of things. What is important is the legal mechanism, how to determine which former Ukrainian region becomes part of Russia. There is a very important precedent in making such determinations, and this precedent was set by the United States. Right before the Kiev coup of 2014, the US asked Russia to intervene. US officials asked Russian officials to use their influence with President Yanukovych and ask him to call off his special forces and not to interfere with the protests. In return, the US officials would call off the protests. The Russians did as they had been asked, and the Americans did the exact opposite of what they had promised. The Americans shipped in snipers who took up positions in public buildings. These snipers killed some large number of people. Then they blamed Yanukovych for these killings. They forced Yanukovych to flee the Ukraine to avoid getting killed. The Russians then inquired, "What gives?" And the official American answer was, "Sorry, but it was the will of the people." The will of the people, you see. Ah, thought the Russians, how awfully clever. Almost immediately, Crimea voted to secede from the Ukraine and join the Russian Federation. It was the will of the people, you see. And then in September of 2022, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson voted to secede from the Ukraine and to join Russia. That was also the will of the people. What shall be the will of the people of Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk, Nikolaev, and Odessa? And how about Sumy, Poltava, Cherkasy, Kirovograd, and, last but not least, Kiev? Only time will tell. But what would you do? Join rich and prosperous Russian Federation, or stay within a rapidly depopulating, impoverished, failed state? I believe the choice for them would be obvious. The choice for Russia is less obvious. How much of the former Ukraine does Russia really want? Whatever happens, it will be the will of the people, but not the will of Trump's people. Of that, we can be certain. Part 6. Stealing Russia's Money. After the start of the special military operation, the West froze Russia's sovereign reserves. Most of them were entrusted to Euroclear in Belgium. Most of the money was invested in Eurobonds. A small part of the money, something like 10 billion, was entrusted to banks in the US. The European Union also imposed sanctions on Russia, 19 packets of them. They were supposed to bring the Russian economy to its knees, but instead they helped Russia's import replacement programs. They allowed Russia to cut its dependence on oil and gas exports. Russia partially replaced oil and gas revenues with grain, fertilizer, chemicals, machinery, weapons, battle-tested ones. Instead of hurting Russia, the sanctions hurt the European Union. The Russian economy continued to grow while the EU stagnated. The fiscal positions of major EU countries and the UK are disastrous. Their major pet project, the former Ukraine, ate up tens of billions of euros. It now turns out that a lot of this money had been stolen. Around $50 billion went to Zelensky's personal offshore accounts and crypto wallets. And so the Europeans can no longer afford to continue financing the former Ukraine. They have been eyeing the Russian sovereign funds in Euroclear and salivating profusely. It must be infuriating. There's the money right there in Brussels, but they can't have any. So far, they have borrowed the interest on these funds and gave that to the Ukrainians. They were hoping that this is somehow legal. It isn't. They will have to pay it all back eventually in pounds of flesh if need be. But they want the rest of the money very, very badly. The Belgians, of course, would have none of it. Euroclear holds trillions in funds from all over the world. If it turned out that these funds can be stolen just like that, it would be a disaster. Not just Euroclear, but the entire European banking system would lose all trust. But the temptation to steal Russia's money is proving to be positively debilitating. Vladimir Putin, being a lawyer, pointed out that it wouldn't even be theft. Theft, he said, is misappropriation through clandestine means. This would be misappropriation in full public view, and that would make it not theft but robbery. The Russians have prepared for this eventuality. There is many times more European wealth in Russia than Russian wealth in Europe. If the Europeans do the unthinkable and take Russia's money, Russia would compensate by taking theirs. Russia would win twice. Trust in the European banking system would be destroyed, wiping out a major competitor. And European assets in Russia would be nationalized along with the revenues they earn. These facts are well known. Nevertheless, EU leaders keep prattling on about more sanctions and taking Russia's money. You'd expect them to start to experience some amount of cognitive dissonance, but that would require them to know big words like cognitive and dissonance. Instead, they sit there like dogs with sausages balanced on their noses, waiting for the signal that it's okay to eat the sausages. That signal will never come. Or if they like, they're violating the first rule of holes. If you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. The hole in question may very well turn out to be their grave. But let's not tell them. They might get upset and do something even more stupid. So much for the Europeans, but then here comes Mr. Trump. He has some brilliant new plan which is unfortunately illegal. Trump proposed an investment scheme for the Ukraine's reconstruction. It would be controlled by the US but financed by $100 billion in stolen Russian assets. Another $100 billion would come from the European Union, which doesn't have that money. And 50% of it all would be sent back to Washington. Why? Because the Washingtonians like to eat. Or maybe because the US is just itching to forfeit all of its Russian investments along with the EU. In any case, proposing things that are illegal does not a peace proposal make. Does Mr. Trump know big words like cognitive and dissonance? Part 7. Who the hell invited the Europeans? After Trump's team socialized their peace proposal, the Europeans and the Ukrainians gathered in Geneva. Their goal, I suppose, was to formulate a counter-proposal. Quite predictably, they lashed out at Trump's fancy ideas. Russia should cease fire immediately, NATO should introduce peacekeeping troops, and so on and so forth. Yada yada la-di-da la-la. The U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was present at this non-event. As he was leaving, someone from the gaggle of correspondents shouted out a question. What about the European counter-proposal? Rubio allowed himself a brief grimace of disdain. There is no European counter-proposal. The Europeans were on hand as well. Atlantis is not sinking, they declared. We shall not surrender any of our territory, they shouted in a tiny voice. And there we have it. Putin, on a state visit to beautiful Kyrgyzstan, was asked about this non-event as well. These people there, they seem to be a little out of their minds, Putin said. The Europeans' remaining challenge is to try to ingest and digest several million Ukrainian Nazis. It will be their choice whether to choke or to die of indigestion. Europe seems to have forgotten that it is not a subject, it is an object. It is an American colony that is unfortunately suffering from Trump derangement disorder. With its attempt to insert itself into the situation, Europe made itself look ridiculous. It is like a bag lady living on a park bench that you gave a sandwich to once out of pity, and now she hobbles after you screeching, "But what about our relationship?" Part 8. The Only Adults in the Room. Russia has recently received the latest American draft of their peace proposal, in secret, and that's a very good sign. Whether the Americans manage to prevent further leaks remains to be seen. But if they do manage, then peace negotiations might move forward. Speaking in beautiful Kyrgyzstan, Vladimir Putin said that Russia is ready for serious discussions. The U.S. proposals are a start, can perhaps serve as a foundation for a peace proposal, but details remain to be determined. It all has to be expressed in diplomatic language, of course, and the decisions that are reached have to be recognized by all the major international players, probably not the Europeans, certainly not the Europeans who stole lots of American money with Ukrainian help, and certainly not the Ukrainians. The Ukraine is no longer a player. The Ukraine is now a piece of sports gear, like a puck or a ball or a shuttlecock that the major international players can punt around. This is what happens to defeated nations, and defeated nations are by definition all those that pick a fight with Russia.